Hello, everyone.
What's up?
Nice
Hello.
to meet you,
Hello.
Peter. Finally, name and face together. It's nice to meet you, Peter.
Nice to meet you too.
Anna, good to see you. Dr. Marshall, nice to see you. Miss Souls Giver, yes. Nice to see you
Great
all.
seeing you as well.
Thank you. Thank you. So I am going to be stepping in as the moderator for today. Unfortunately, our scheduled moderator is having computer problems, and so she can't do it. So rather than us trying to gather bios and everything this quickly, I will just give you a minute and ask you to introduce yourself. So I'll say your name, our speakers, our panel for today. But when you start speaking, just go ahead and introduce yourself. Um, Name, university, what year you're in, and your major and or minor. So if you want to say more, you can, but that should do it. Um, Chris, if you could make me co-host, I will also enable some sharing with for people. Unless you've already done that, I don't know. How's everybody doing today?
Doing great.
Excellent. Excellent. It's good to have you all here. Looking forward to the session. Chris, are you there? I must have stepped away. So everybody knows you'll have about 15 minutes to present. I'll hold questions until the end if we have an audience, and then we can open it up to Q&A at the end. Is that good? Do, 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 do. We're a quiet group today. Chris, did you make other folks co-hosts already? Okay, thank you. Dr. Torrigiano, you're muted.
I managed to get in at the last minute.
And that's great. Welcome. You want it
Thank
back?
you.
You want it back?
I have all the screens up yet. I just got as far as this.
Okay.
So you start and I'll jump in.
Yes, that'll be fine. All right. Well, I'm also in the process of pulling things up, so it'll be a matter of who gets there first, I guess.
Okay. All right, let's see.
Hmm. Everyone, give us just a second. We are still in the process of getting set up, so we'll get started here in just a minute. Can you all check and just make sure that you can share your screens so that when it is your presentation is up, that's all set to go? Then I'll pull up the slide. I get a thumbs up if you're good. Okay, good. Peter, were you able to share? Do you need to share, first of all, and are you able to? Okay, great. Okay. This is a little weird for me too. Okay. Is everyone seeing the screen? And is it Torrijano or Gano?
Torregano.
Or Gano. Excellent. There's weird, odd things happening. I'm not quite sure why. What is happening? I'm just so kind of confused right now. Almost there, everybody. Give us just another minute. Okay. I think I should be able to see this. And I'm sharing my screen. Let's see if that works. All right. Are you seeing the slide? Okay. Now. Okay.
There you go.
Okay.
I can see it now.
Okay. And do you want to, are you set up to take the lead and me provide support, or you still want me to go ahead and open this?
I think I can do it.
Well, I am here.
Okay, thank you.
And I told everyone that they are to introduce themselves. So
okay. Good afternoon, everyone. I just have to share from a teacher perspective that technology, when it works, is wonderful. And when it doesn't, it causes a lot of problems. So this is one day when technology wasn't working for us so very well. I'm sure that you all are aware of the controversies that are going on in the public eye with the Derek Chauvin trial. The defense rested yesterday, so we may get the verdict today or not, but we'd like you all to know that this is a safe space and we are here to support you if necessary and as needed. And we'd also like to state to our panelists and those who are on the call that this event is being recorded. So if you stay on, that indicates your approval and your agreement that you don't mind this being on and being recorded this afternoon. Okay. I'd also like to share that you can contact us through our Facebook page and on Padlet, and I will be showing those links in the chat. So at this time, I'd like to turn it over to our panelists. Autumn, why don't you start with your introduction?
Hello, my name is Martino. I am a senior at Clarion University. I am part of the History and Sociology department with my major in history and minor in sociology. I will be presenting later on today about the women's suffrage movement, primarily as it takes place in rural Western Pennsylvania.
Okay. Who's next? Philip?
Can you guys hear me? Yeah, it's a
Yes.
pleasure to meet you all. I'm Philip Colen. I'm from Indiana University of Pennsylvania. I'm in my sophomore year right now, and I'm a biochem major. And I'll be presenting with Theodore Reinhardt on our topic on defund the police and what it means.
Okay, Theodore, would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Hi, I'm Theodore Reinhardt. I'm a finance major at Indiana University of Pennsylvania. I'm a sophomore as well. And you've already met my partner, Philip, and we'll be presenting our topic of defund the police.
Okay. So who is scheduled to go first? Oh, I'm sorry, Peter. Peter, please introduce yourself.
Okay, my name is Pierre Jagello. I'm from Clarion University, and my major is in criminal justice, and I'm a sophomore. I'll be presenting on Philando Castile.
Okay, so I'm going to assume that Autumn is supposed to go first, since she's listed first in the program. So Autumn, I turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you so much. So I did my research with the history department at Clarion University, along with Dr. Senko and Dr. Diamond. And the point of this research was to uncover more academic information about how the suffrage movement, the women's suffrage movement, took place in rural areas of Pennsylvania. Dr. Diamond had asked me to apply to see if I'd be granted to speak at this event. So I'm very honored and thankful that you all have allowed me to come and speak on this. A lot of times suffrage gets overlooked as being a civil right for individuals, but being able to vote gives political power to individuals and is very important for various communities. When looking at the African American community, for many women, there is intersectionality with suffrage in terms of race and gender. And we see how suffrage plays out throughout American history with the African community when we have the institution of the Jim Crow laws, which prevent voting for many individuals, and unfortunately is a great hindrance and oppression because of the inability to partake in that civil right and in that political authority and ability. For my research primarily though, I do focus more on the gender aspect. And as I said, it takes place in the time frame of 1900 to 1920 and in Pennsylvania. So the reason we had chose to focus on the rural communities of Pennsylvania is because generally when historical research is done on women's suffrage, it's done so in the context of a national event and usually within urban areas. Little is known about rural areas such as Clarion. So for my research, I did focus on 3 counties specifically. Clarion was one, and then there's also Jefferson and Indiana. And within these communities, we got to see how suffrage for women functioned within the rural areas, what the reactions of those residents were, and how that went along with the national narrative and how it challenged it in some ways. So when analyzing these communities, there seems to be a national narrative that rural areas were more likely to oppose women's suffrage and urban areas were more likely to support it. Upon my research, it's out, at least within the state of Pennsylvania. The research is greatly focused in Pennsylvania, so this is not applied on a national scale, but in Pennsylvania, the divide technically was among the geography of the counties. So eastern counties were more like this. And the reason I actually chose County was because they both voted in support of the state referendum for women to be able to vote within Pennsylvania. The state referendum for Pennsylvania did not, unfortunately, were not able to vote until the ratification of the 19th Amendment on 1920. So focused on within these rural areas is how did the suffragettes campaign and what were their strategies and what were the similarities between that on a national level and what made them individual. And so a common divide within the women's suffrage movement as a whole was whether or not to implement militant techniques. And for many different social movements, this is commonly an issue within so many groups is should we implement more militant tactics or not? And for the suffragettes in the rural areas, they had determined that not necessarily that they, on an ethical basis, opposed militant tactics, but that they felt it would not be an advantage to them based on their location. And so what that means is that they utilized what is known as teaching methods. Teaching methods are holding public meetings, public forums, the creation and distribution of instructional pamphlets, informing individuals on what the movement is and why they should support it. And the reason a lot of these rural suffragettes chose not to use militant techniques, because on a national level, you do see some suffragettes choose not to, but others that choose to do so. And the reasoning behind that was how separate spheres really held a strong grip in rural communities. And when I say separate spheres, I'm referring to a very strong ideology that was current in the 20th century American society, where it was believed that men had power and authority in certain areas of society, and women had power and authority in other areas. So for men, they were thought to be involved in politics, government, and business. And that women were not to be involved in those areas, but were to instead have authority in the household and in regards to children. So with that mindset, there resulted a lot of propaganda surrounding the women's suffrage movement. It began to be depicted as an extremist group of women who were, quote unquote, stripping themselves of their womanhood and femininity and were trying to overpower society and specifically overpower men until they would be put in a position of oppression. So a lot of suffragettes had to combat this propaganda. And in these rural communities, a lot of suffragettes were afraid that militant tactics would only confirm a lot of the propaganda being held against them instead of disproving it. So these teaching techniques allowed them to highlight the sophistication of the movement and to prove that femininity was not sacrificed within this movement, that there was a woman who wanted to be a suffragist and who wanted the right to vote could do so, and that didn't make them any less of a woman, or it didn't sacrifice their femininity in any way. In my paper, I focus greatly on one of the teaching forms they used, which was the use of rallies. And one of the most notorious rallies for the women's suffrage movement in Pennsylvania is the Justice Bell Rally. The Justice Bell Rally was a rally in which the Pennsylvania suffragists visited every single county within Pennsylvania. It was a 5,000-mile journey that spanned it over the course of 4 months. If I was to be tasked with that in the year 2021, I would find that to be very daunting. So I can only imagine how much work and dedication it took to do that in 1915. And for this rally, they had a replica of the Liberty Bell made, which was known as the Justice Bell. And it was symbolizing this idea that for women to be able to obtain suffrage had to do with the rights owed to them as being citizens. It wasn't about overpowering men or trying to take over the government, quote unquote. It was about achieving civil rights and rights owed to citizens based primarily on citizenship. And the Justice Bell was hung in a way in which it would not reign at all. It remained silent as a way to symbolize the silencing of women's voices in politics and their inability to speak up for themselves and to bring attention to a lot of the issues they were facing. When the 19th Amendment was finally ratified, the bell was rung for each state in the Union, which I thought was a very sweet notion. And this event was very successful in that it did combat a lot of the propaganda that was up against these suffragists. And they were able to address notions of gender and femininity and how this binary system and how it was being implemented into society was impacting them and impacting their political status and their social status. The state referendum, unfortunately, did not get passed. However, I do argue throughout my paper and throughout my research that the lack of the state referendum being passed by no means had a bearing on whether or not the work of these suffragists was successful, because in the end, the ratification of the 19th Amendment was on the basis of all of the work that was being done by all of the suffragists throughout the nation. And that is what I have prepared for today. Are there any questions? I think Dr. Krasowski has his hand raised, if I'm reading that correctly.
I was really just saying good work and thanks for your research. And you're right, as we know, the power to vote has a very strong impact on our communities. So thank you.
Thank you. That was very sweet. I appreciate that.
I just added, sorry, we had Autumn on our podcast as well to talk about her research. She did a great job. I just put a little thing in chat if you want to hear a more extended interview where she talks more detail about her project. If she goes into more detail here, I think she just wants to focus on the overview. But she did a really good job of going to local archives, including in Brookville, and looking at local newspapers and getting a sense of what the feel was here 100 years ago. And it was a very different kind of community in many ways, and also a very similar community in many ways too. So you did a great job, Autumn. Thanks.
Thank you.
Is the Justice Bell a surviving artifact anywhere, or has it been destroyed or lost or anything?
It is a surviving artifact, thankfully, and it is housed in Philadelphia. Off the top of my head, I don't know exactly where in Philadelphia, but in one of the museums there. So yes, it has been preserved, thankfully.
Autumn, did this coincide with any other sort of social justice movement that was happening around the same time? Were they connecting with other efforts to get votes for other groups of people or other kinds of progressive campaigns of any sort?
So within the state of Pennsylvania alone, no. But when you look at the women's suffrage movement on a national content, and I do throughout my paper start talking about it on a national end before I focus on it in Pennsylvania. And what's interesting is the suffrage movement for women has had a relationship with the civil rights movement for African Americans, but the relationship is very complex and changes over time. The women's suffrage movement actually spans from 1848 with the Seneca Falls Convention till 1920. And then once women have the right to vote, it evolves into different feminist social movements throughout time. So at the very origin of it, a lot of suffragettes were on the forefront of supporting the abolishment of slavery. They were one of the very first abolitionists. And when you look at it in its origin, in its early context, a lot of suffragettes decided that they would take a break or a pause per se to focus on the fight for ending slavery. But then after slavery is ended and the 15th Amendment is passed, which allows African American men to vote, which is absolutely fantastic, Unfortunately, a lot of the politicians who would have been white men were afraid that with slavery now ending and African American men now being able to vote, it was weakening their power over society. And so even though politically it would have made sense to give everyone the right to vote at that moment, since they were already altering and amending the Constitution, they did not give women the right to vote. And that caused resentment in the group. And that is when you first see a split between suffragists and some that still choose to support civil rights, but others that do not. And that continues throughout the movement. You see some suffragists being inclusive of all women who were trying to obtain the right to vote, including African American women. But unfortunately, you do see many instances of where African American women were not included within the movement and were asked not to campaign with them, or a lot of them to appease white men in obtaining the right to vote and to encourage them to pass it. A lot of times advocated for just white women obtaining the right to vote. And so there are splits within the group. You do see a divide in those who choose to continue to support the civil rights movement and a lot of the liberation for African Americans. And then you see those who do not, who take a more racist turn. Interestingly, for African American women, when the 15th Amendment is passed, they do not receive the right to vote. But then when the 19th Amendment is passed, there were a lot of issues with them still not being able to receive the right to vote, even though they legally should. There's a lot of effort to prevent them from being able to vote. And as I mentioned earlier, this continues again with the Jim Crow laws, in which there are a lot of obstacles being put in place and a lot of people trying to prevent African American voting across the board. So it has definitely been a specific struggle for a lot of African American women within receiving suffrage. And it shows a lot of intersectionality with race and gender in that approach. Did that answer your question? I know I talked for a while.
That was a nice full answer. Thank you.
Are there any other questions?
Okay, you all may think of questions later, and we'll try to have a Q&A at the end of the session. I'm going to turn it over to Philip at this time and Theodore.
Cool, awesome. All right, it's great to see everybody today. I'll share my screen quickly and then we can get started. So Theodore, Teddy, and I were part of the, there you go. We're part of the Promising Scholars at IUP. So one of the things we were tasked to do this semester was we were given 4 options to pick from, including community service. This was one of them, and there were 2 other choices we had, but we both ended up here. So our presentation is about defunding the police and what does it mean. No, that's not it. Sorry. So we worked with Dr. Watson, and this presentation was created to go to a database, and this database would be accessible to students in K through 12. So the point of this presentation is to inform, not really impose an opinion on anybody. So we'll start with the origins of defund the police. So we know the 1960s, 1970s civil rights movement and the Black Panther movement within it. So this is kind of where the idea of defund the police started. And there's a lot of kind of gaps in history right here, but I think one of the people who influenced a lot was Ruth Wilson Gilmore, who around the 1990s also was really pushed for abolishing the police. So this is one of the quotes you may have heard from her. If it takes a village to raise a child, it certainly takes a movement to undo an occupation. So I think she was a big contributing factor to defund the police. So now we're skipping ahead to kind of modern day, and this is the death of George Floyd. So we know May 25th in Minneapolis, police arrested George Floyd, and 17 minutes later, he was found dead after being pinned by 3 police officers and passed away. And police knelt on his neck for nearly 9 minutes. And this is sort of the start of kind of the Black Lives Matter movement, where local protests spread through. And we saw nationwide protests in 2,000 cities and even 60 other countries, including the US, thus beginning the Black Lives Matter movement. So this is taken from the Black Lives Matter website, where it explains the goals of them. So you can read, actually I'll read it through. So one of the things is to draw attention to ways Black people have been treated unfairly through society, whether that is institution, law, and policy, combat police brutality, including the over-policing of minority neighborhoods and abuses from for-profit jails, and the call for better police training and accountability for police misconduct. All three of these things create the Black Lives Matter, and specifically we're looking at the second point, which focuses a bit on defunding the police. But that's background information. So what exactly does defund the police mean? There's two big ways to look at it. So the first more popular idea is we can distribute these funds from policing, lower the police budget, and put these funds where we see most fit, depending on state to state, city to city. And then the more radical idea that isn't quite as popular is to completely abolish our police and prison systems and recreate something. So we'll focus on the first topic, which is redistribution of funds and resources. Now, the big misconception behind the term defund the police is a lot of people think that means immediately cut all police spending and kind of get rid of the police force. But most of the time when people say defund the police, they aren't meaning that. They mean we can use the money from policing and put it into areas that we see better fit, such as social services, education, and employment. And the concept behind this is if we distribute these funds to these areas of need, then society wouldn't require as much police funding. One of the big key points behind this is the amount of funding that goes to the police. And you could see right here, in 2017, $193 billion in funding was created by the police to be used. Another big point is that armed police aren't the answer to everything. So topics like mental health, homelessness, traffic, noise complaints, they don't require an armed officer to resolve it, rather a social worker. And we see this in some of the bigger cities, such as Minneapolis, where cities have begun implementing social workers to diffuse situations where police would simply worsen the results. They aren't trained for these things, whereas social workers are. There you go. So an example of this is Eugene, Oregon. So Eugene, Oregon is a city in Oregon where they have implemented a system they call CAHOOTS, or Crisis Assistance Helping Out on the Streets. Now, rather than dispatching a police officer at every call they get, they can determine what is more needed, whether that's an armed officer or in this case, CAHOOTS, which is one medic and one crisis worker. And when they determine that CAHOOTS is needed, then they'll use that service instead of the police. Right now, CAHOOTS handles about 20% of all of their 911 calls. And as you can see by the funding numbers, police have needed $90 million a year, while CAHOOTS has only used $2.1 billion a year. And this money can be distributed elsewhere throughout the city. Now, the second topic is to abolish the police system entirely. And I found this picture interesting because if you showed this picture to anybody, you could honestly say it's from 2020, 2021, but this photo is actually from 1960. And this ties into the biggest point of abolishing the police system entirely, is that reform hasn't and will not happen. There's civil rights movement all the way from pretty much since it began, since slavery was abolished, to 2021. There have been multiple efforts to reform, get rid of police brutality, just create a better system. And we haven't seen that yet. It's gotten better, obviously, but it's not at the point where it's a good system. So a lot of people call for it to be completely torn down, which ties to the second point of, for a proper police system to be put in place, you must abolish the entire system and then transform it. You can't change something that's not working into something that does work, but rather tear the entire thing down and create a new system from the ground up. And then third point is obviously ACAB. I don't know if I'm allowed to say that on this Zoom. We're being recorded, so I won't. But the idea behind that is just there simply are no great cops. Yeah, so thank you for your time. The final thing we'd like to talk about is kind of how this presentation has impacted both of us. So I'm a biochemistry major at IUP, so we don't really get a lot of courses that deal with kind of social issues. So kind of being able to do a presentation like this and learning more about what's happening in the United States and the community around me as well has been pretty enlightening. We always see, at least for me, like I'll see in the news like little snippets, like I know recently Mr. Wright and also the George Floyd trials being brought back up. Like I see these things in the news, but I don't feel informed about it, and I don't really realize what's happening until this presentation. So it's honestly pretty nice. So even like local things like Pittsburgh, I hear about people are kind of protesting in Pittsburgh, and I have the general idea. You see it on people's social media. You get a general gist of what's happening, but I never felt like I really understood what was happening and kind of the reason behind it until this presentation. So I really enjoyed doing this.
Yeah, me too. I'm a finance major, so I don't really have those opportunities like Phil kind of said. But I think doing this presentation and doing all this research with Philip really opened up my eyes, because I would say before I even started this presentation, when I heard defund the police, I thought it was like completely just like get rid of them, and I didn't understand the concept until we did more research and found out more of the allocation of the funds to different percentages. So just doing all this research really helped open up my eyes to see different perspectives, and I'm really thankful for that. So next we have some more things to go over, just some questions, some things we'd like some of you guys to think about. And basically a little activity for you guys. So we move to the next part here.
Okay, yeah, so this is stuff that would have gone into the presentation that we'll present to children. So our goal wasn't to influence the children influence any of the students, like which way to think. We're not telling them to think abolish the police, and we're not telling them to think increase police funding. But through some questions like this, like, do you think that diverting funds from police to programs like Cahoots should be performed, and why? Students who were kind of questioning kind of the same boat Teddy and I were in, like, we know what's happening in the news, we see it in the news, but we don't really understand how it could be applicable to us. Questions like these would kind of help show them. If you guys want to answer these questions, you can do that, but we can also just run through the slides.
I'd probably suggest putting all the questions up and finishing your presentation before we open it.
Okay, that sounds good. So we'd also provide students with scenarios such as you're the mayor of a city with a high violent crime rate and high use of deadly police force. So what can you do? Well, there's multiple options to take, and then students would be able to choose an option that they find is best suited for the situation and then explain it. And I think it'd be interesting to see how a student's choice could differ from before the presentation and after it once they're given more information. Once again, another question based on the information presented. How has your opinion on defund the police changed before and after the presentation? And do you believe that the term defund the police has a place in the Black Lives Matter movement? And we also have more information at the end, but it's going to be a little different once it's placed into the database. So in presentation form like this, it's a little bit strange. That concludes our presentation.
So would you guys like us to go back to the slides and just if you guys want to look at the questions again, or yeah? All right, Phil. Maybe go back to the first question there. Yeah, right there. And then we can start, and then we can go through the scenario with them too.
I really like this idea of this Cahoots, and just on a personal reference, you know, I had a very little boy who was 6 years old. It was visiting my home, and he was having some suicidal ideation. And so I did, call for help, for mental health help. And they said they would not come to my house unless they could be accompanied by 2 police officers. And I said, then don't come. Do not bring police officers to my house for a 6-year-old boy. I will not let them in. And ultimately, the mental health provider did come alone, but it was, you could see he was very upset with me. I don't know that the little boy got the adequate care that he would have gotten had I permitted police. So I really love this idea of cahoots because police don't need to respond to everything. They shouldn't need to respond to everything. And if we could move those monies around to these other resources, I just think that would be a fabulous thing. So not really a question, but I guess a comment.
I love this. Oh, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I love this idea and this concept. I think it's great. The police are trained in law enforcement and not mental health. And it is kind of strange that we rely on them to respond to calls like that because they are not adequately trained and can't really provide that much of a service. I think having cahoots is great. I did have a question to go along with it. You guys' presentation was absolutely great, by the way. I loved it. For the cahoots, you had talked about specifically in a city in Oregon, how this idea of redistribution of funds and resources is being implemented. Did you by any chance see a correlation with that and lower crime rates? Or did that come up at all in your research?
That's a good question. We didn't really look into that section too much. I'll go back to our Kahoot slide. We were more focused on the change in budget, honestly, and how it dropped from 90 million to 2.1 million. I know that Los Angeles and New York are doing similar things, not quite to this level, but yeah, that's something that we need to look more into, honestly. That's a good question.
I think I was just going to offer the perspective, going right along with what the previous commenters have said. But I was thinking and reflecting on the fact that there are so many cities, especially, I don't know about the smaller towns like the ones that our schools are in, for instance, but a lot of cities are looking at these kind of alternative funding models that have a portion of the budget that's going to increase services in some areas with the idea that police will then kind of be moved out of those areas. There's one city, and I'm not going to even say the name because I can't be sure that I have the right one in mind, and probably more that are really thinking about that as not an either or, but that these are services that are all part of kind of community health initiatives. And so it's not that the budget is divided and some is taken away from policing, but that these new units are added that are part of a community response team. And so the budget is all one. It's just that now there are more people with a wider variety of expertise and experience who are responding to calls in the community. So if there's the one that we like to talk about so much is mental health. So if there's a mental health issue, then the police wouldn't go to that call. The same budget is also supporting another team of people who are better able to respond to that. Whereas if it's a domestic violence situation, then that's a call that's more appropriate for police, but maybe the police are accompanied by a team, right? And so it's just a different way kind of imagining what services are needed in a community. So that I was just kind of thinking about, does it have to be a reduction of one budget and an increase of another, or whether there's even another kind of possibility here that some cities are beginning to explore.
Yeah, almost like a umbrella to hold in like multiple. Yeah, I see. Yeah, it's good. Good comment.
It could also, oh, do you want to say something, Philip?
Oh, no, you're good. I'll go after you.
I was just going to say, they can learn from models around the world. We're like the most over-policed society that actually uses violence to control people. And the society that has to use violence to control people is not a society that has a legitimacy. There's a lot of examples of community policing in Europe that actually work and that deal with, including with different immigrant communities. Some don't work. I mean, there's definitely been problems. But you also see a lot of police that are actually working with actually members of the community to actually have an effective thing and not be an occupying force. Because I think it also depends on class, race, and all sorts of factors of how people look at it. Some people are very willing to call the police for very major things. Other people don't. And that kind of distrust is actually problematic for public safety in general. So if they could work on it in a way, and it's not like a really new model. That's just, if they can look at other models around the world, we can learn from that experience. But I liked both your presentations. I thought it was helpful to kind of look at that too. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Oh, that reminds me of, I was watching a documentary about counter policing in Philadelphia specifically, and community distrust. There's a big disconnect between police and its community. They don't see them as a helpful service you can go up to. And one of the communities they were talking to, they're like, well, if the crime rate's so high and there's always these like issues of like the police aren't doing enough for our community. So they ask citizens like, why don't you just go to the police about it? And they say the police won't help them. They just make issues worse. But at the same time, they recognize that they need something to help their community. It simply isn't the police.
Yeah, in my psychology class, I know we went over police as far as like the, I guess the psychological part, or in terms of psychology, is like what's the goal of the police? What's the goal of prison? Is it supposed to stop? Is it supposed to reform? What is it supposed to do? And is it actually doing it? So that's just something I've gone over in some of my other classes.
Yeah, there's a lot of topics we could branch off from here. We could talk about like broken prison systems, and if you want to tune into some of our other members of our group, Jorge and Marissa, that's not her name, but they're doing a presentation about autism in the LGBTQ community and kind of how they interact with the police. So highly check them out. It's a good presentation.
I have a question. With defunding the police, it started out with a lot of negativity. Based upon your research, what do you think it would take to get people on board? Because I heard someone say that they didn't fully understand the concept of defunding the police until this presentation. What about winning the hearts and minds of many others to help them to understand? What saith you?
Yeah, so sorry, Teddy, you want to go first? You want me to
go ahead. Go ahead.
All right. Yeah, one of the big issues whenever trying to convince people like, hey, defund the police is, it's not exactly what you think it is the idea that, well, if we take money away from the police, then violent crime rates are just going to start skyrocketing and we wouldn't have any protection. But that goes back to our earlier point. So we don't need that protection all the time. You don't need an armed officer to interact with a traffic stop and possibly make things worse. I think the biggest issue is just kind of the stigma that surrounds the term defund the police and kind of the negativity that's not quite as strongly associated with it, but still is, and thinking that if we get rid of our entire prison system, then people would just be able to roam freely and do, whatever they want, and crime rates would skyrocket, when that isn't the case.
Yeah, I would say, I think a big, idea or issue that I think everyone should try to understand is trying to be open-minded to change, because, I think nowadays you see a lot of stuff on the news and the media, and whatever it says, you're going to have a reaction to it without even doing your own research. So I think having an open mind to looking further into an issue, to knowing more of the facts, more of the reasoning behind it, is really what can sway people. Because, if you just see something online or in the news, that reaction is what you're going to stick with until you actually do your own research. And I think that willingness to go further and research and find the facts, find the different perspectives is what really, educates people on, certain issues.
Questions, please hold them until the end, and we're going to turn the floor over. He can do his presentation.
Can the previous group stop sharing, please?
Can you guys see it?
We can see it.
Okay. All right. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. This presentation is a qualitative inquiry into the Philando Castile incident. Have an issue. Sorry about that. All right, background on the incident. So the shooting occurred on July 6, 2016 in Falcon Heights suburb in St. Paul, Minnesota. A key thing that happened too is that this is one of the cases that were recorded using Facebook Live. But even before the shooting, unfortunately, there was a list of other similar incidents that included deaths of unarmed individuals and stuff like that. Just one day earlier, on July 5th, 2016, police officers fatally shot another African-American male, Alton Sterling. Former President Obama said, "These incidents are symptomatic of the broader challenges within our criminal justice system. The racial disparities that appear across the system year after year, and the resulting lack of trust that exists between law enforcement and the many of the communities they serve." Looking into the incident, like I said, that was before. It happened on July 6, 2016, around 9:05 p.m. Dashcam video shows Officer Yanez conducting a vehicle stop for a busted taillight. The car is occupied by Philando Castile, the driver, his girlfriend, Diamond Reynolds, and her 4-year-old daughter. Officer Yanez gave reasons for this stop, saying you have a broken taillight, and asked for a driver's license and insurance. Mr. Castile informed the officer that he had a firearm. Officer Yanez responds by grabbing his service weapon, saying, "Okay, don't pull it out, don't pull it out." Officer Yanez fired his weapon 7 times. Diamond Reynolds began recording the incident on Facebook Live. After the shooting, Officer Yanez had continued shouting, "Don't pull it out, don't move." Ms. Reynolds reacted by saying, "Stay with me. We got pulled over by a busted taillight in the back, and the police he's covered." Officer Yanez interjected and told him, "I told him not to reach for it. I told him to get his hands out." Ms. Reynolds responded saying, "You told him to get his ID, sir, his driver's license." During the medical examination, the medical examiner described the placement of the bullet wounds as a tight cluster. There was presence of THC in Mr. Castile's blood. However, there was no way to tell when he smoked or if he was still intoxicated during the incident. His death was described or classified as a homicide. On November 16, 2016, Ramsey County Attorney John Choi announced his decision to charge Officer Yanez. The charges included second-degree manslaughter, 2 felony counts for dangerous discharge of a firearm. Attorney Choi said, "No reasonable officer knowing, seeing, and hearing what Officer Yanez did at the time would have used deadly force under these circumstances." This was the first time an officer had been charged for a fatal shooting in Minnesota in more than 200 cases and spanning over 3 decades. The charges require prosecutors to show Officer Yanez acted with culpable negligence in a manner that was reckless and unreasonable for the situation. They also had to prove that he had endangered the lives of both Diamond Reynolds and her 4-year-old daughter. Note that one of the bullets struck the center console adjacent to Ms. Reynolds, and another bullet had lodged into the seat next to the 4-year-old. The jury, there was 12 members of the jury. There were 7 men, 5 women, 10 whites, and 2 blacks. There was a deadlock first, and then the jury decided not guilty on all counts. They said that the elements did not satisfy elements of the crime that would warrant a conviction. Officer Yanez during the trial said he had no choice. "I was scared to death. I thought I was going to die." The result of the acquittal resulted in protests. Hundreds of people gathered on the steps of the minor Minnesota State Capitol to protest the acquittal of Officer Yanez. Many were holding signs reading "Black Lives Matter, no justice, no peace." The protesters marched around city streets and even at one point blocked 194 in St. Paul. The city of St. Anthony had entered into an agreement with Officer Yanez that will pay him $48,500 in one lump sum. The payment covers more than 600 hours of work and also unused personal leave. Other settlements include the mother of Philando Castile, Valerie Castile, reached a settlement with the city of St. Anthony for $2.995 million, but the money was not from taxes, it was from insurance money. Another was Diamond Reynolds and her 4-year-old reached a settlement with the city of St. Anthony, the League of Minnesota Cities Insurance Trust, and the city of Roseville for $800,000. The practice of police using minor traffic violations as a precursor for traffic stops is common. For example, Walter Scott stopped for a non-functional brake light, Laverne Jones stopped for a seatbelt violation, and many more show this. Research conducted by Woods found that routine traffic stops have the potential for being dangerous or even fatal, and civilians are most likely to be injured than law enforcement. St. Anthony PD continues this practice in their claims of racial profiling. African Americans accounted for 44% of 650 traffic violations. The concern is that the continued practice is going to yield more incidents following like Philando Castile. Officer Yanez provided 2 probable causes. The first was a non-working brake light, and the second, he radioed assistance for what he described as a vehicle whose occupants just looked like the people that were involved in the robbery. These 2 different causes require 2 different approaches. The first requires a routine traffic stop, which is considered low in danger, and officers are just described as the approach with caution. The second call should be followed by what is called a felony stop, which officers are trained to wait for backup and not to approach until sufficient backup arrives. Officer Yanez approached Mr. Castile's vehicle in a manner that resembles a routine traffic stop. He appeared to have no suspicion and reaction to any perceived danger, especially from a robbery suspect. Now looking into prosecutors. Prosecutors received tremendous pressure from both sides when a high-profile incident involves a police officer. Officers view the charges against one of their own as the ultimate act of betrayal, mainly for the reason that the 2 entities work together to help prosecute criminal defendants. The public perceives the officers as having violating the law, and mass protests, looting, business fires, and demand for change, and videos of incidents heighten the pressure for prosecutors. There is a concern that prosecutors have been given into public pressure to pursue charges against officers, knowing that the high chance the trial will result in acquittal and no conviction. The biggest question when concerning this case should have been determining whether a conviction is likely. The decision on the charges should have been guided on the likelihood of success and not on public stressors. Fear is a factor. The standard for officers to use deadly force was merely just to have a fear, an articulation of fear at the moment for their lives or the life of someone else. So in that split decision, if they had fear for themselves or someone else, they could use deadly force. But due to the public outcry due to many who have been shot and unarmed has caused departments to update their use of force policies. The new standards are higher than just fear and now require things such as like imminent danger and imminent threat, rather than fear. For example, like Los Angeles PD, Chicago PD, and New Orleans PD have all updated their use of force policies. Thank you.
Does anyone have any questions for Peter?
Yes. Thank you so much. Such a great presentation. I really appreciate it. All three have been, honestly. So Peter, I actually want to ask you about one of the last things that you said. And you were saying that prosecutors often are coming under pressure to prosecute officers who are involved in these situations, even if they don't think that they might get a prosecution, right? So they're prosecuting the cases even though they don't think there's a great chance of winning the case. And you said that you thought the likelihood of success should be the standard to prosecute. Did I get that right?
Yeah. Like
Okay.
what that goes into is more looking at like, say, because like the higher the charge, like say manslaughter, second degree, that requires more evidence and more things. Like say there wasn't enough evidence they seen to convict. So what they should have went after was like things like say just lower, like saying putting like just saying that they were like putting lives of others at risk or something lower so that they could get success and get a conviction.
Oh, I see. So I'm glad you explained that, because I thought you were saying that the case shouldn't be brought if the prosecutor didn't feel that there was a pretty good chance of success in the case. And that you're actually not saying that. You're saying that maybe a lower charge would have gotten a prosecution in the face of a higher charge, and then the person just gets off altogether.
Yes.
Okay. So I would say that that's an important distinction to make, because I suspect, there is no win here, but I suspect that communities might also be pretty outraged about a lower level charge being brought when they think that a high crime has been committed. And here you are charging the man with chewing gum on the corner, right? And I think he just killed somebody. So yeah, I think that that's an interesting thought and reasoning process for us to kind of work through. Like, what is the standard that we think should be held in these cases? Is any jail time better than no jail time? Is any prosecution better than no prosecution, et cetera? Thank you.
Yeah. It just falls on like under like the circumstances. Like say you have to be beyond a reasonable doubt that the person did that crime. So like 99% sure that he did it. And that's a pretty high standard to put.
Thank you, Peter. Your presentation sort of reminds me, actually they all remind me of some important things, in that we don't live in sort of a bubble, and that there's a lot of historical context to this, right? This fear the police have, whether it's justified or not, if that's an excuse, I mean, people could fear anything for any reason, but it's built off historical circumstances of the history of this country, and even how the police were founded and what they're used for, particularly in certain communities, particularly in the South, right? Were used partly as for catching runaway slaves, for instance, right? When you have that sort of pedigree in that history, and the use of force to control is so common throughout history, that's going to continue. And so the question is, how do you understand the history to break those sort of things? And I'm not sure just charging someone with even minor things is enough. It might have to be a whole reimagining of how it's, as the lesson was, not just how you police, but what are the tactics used, even by the people who have to deal with violence. And that is a deeper question and a deeper thing that's harder to do. And that's including holding people accountable. And I know it's hard. But so many places around the world, they deal with violence and the police are not even armed. Why things in this country turn so quickly to major violence and the state basically taking someone's life, because if the police officer works for the state, it's the government taking someone's life, is a real serious thing that we have to consider. It seems like the basic violation of what our country is about, right? If you have the right to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, they just took all of that away because they had a fear. So the question is how do you overcome that? I don't think you're going to have an answer to that, but I think it's important to understand what's happened and why we've come to that thing, and why maybe if they pull Amy over, sorry, Amy, from calling you out, they're not going to probably pull a gun, right? But maybe for someone else, they would. And that could be gendered as well as race-based. And that is a problematic. Or even if they don't pull a gun, why would things escalate so quickly? Why would someone having a taillight, or recently again, because they have something hanging off their windshield, like their wearer, why does that result in someone's dying? It doesn't seem even logical in any way whatsoever. So I would say, I like what you're doing. Think bigger is all I'm just encouraging you to, or at least think broader too. I'll shut up now. Thanks.
A lot of what's going on in American policing is deals with the people or police officers' reluctance to change. A lot of the current problems exist because officers are doing things the old way when we're in an era where there has to be change. Pulling guns on people, that's because of what is known as danger signifiers. When people look a certain way or meet certain characteristics and they perceive them as being danger. So they're doing a do-guard and trying to defend themselves. It's just that in modern time, that's not a good idea. And the practice of stopping people for what we call pretext stops, minor brake tags violations, you find that they're still not learning. In the process of doing the research, even after Philando Castile, that police department, St. Anthony, is still stopping people for minor violations. And things are escalating. And the answer to it is better training. We're gonna have to I guess you can say, instill in the veteran officers, because they're the ones who are reluctant to change, that there has to be change in the way that policing is done. Because how many times do they get out and pull guns on a traffic violation, even if they didn't want to stop? But we're finding that they're doing that now. And once you go up the use of force continuum, in most cases, there's no going back down. They're not going to de-escalate and things are getting out of control. It's like the 13-year-old. He pointed the gun, the 13-year-old dropped it. We don't know all the facts and circumstances, but they're questioning him. And the last thing I'm going to say is the response. The government's response to it, if you notice, the recent shooting in Minnesota, the whatever, I don't mean to say whatever his name is, but within 24, 48 hours, the officer was arrested, but they charged the officer with manslaughter. They can always up the charge to murder, but for right now, it is manslaughter. And was it done to appease the public, or was it done because that's the true charge? Was it done to calm the anger in the street? That remains to be seen. So that is what we're basically looking at.
I mean, the question is, why are we using police to pull people over for minor things? And why is that being used as a fundraising tactic by the government? These places that are doing this often are using this as a way to basically help pay for the police force and other sorts of services. The police don't exist as a fundraising opportunity to charge people with fines, which lead to these kind of problems in the first place. And even if they do have it, most of you get a warning, and there's no reason why something about it is like, just please go fix your taillights and leave it at that. Even if you sent them a note in the mail, we have your license plate number. We noticed you have a broken taillight. You have a week to fix it. Do you have to pull someone over with a gun to tell them to do that? It seems illogical and inhumane to like resort to such really extreme tactics over such minor things in life that are so unimportant. I mean, maybe it's important to have a taillight to some extent, but you don't have to kill someone over that or whatever else it is. And it always seems to be these minor things that seem to escalate to that. I'm sure there's other reasons, and there's always I'm not saying it's not justified use of force, but it seems that this is the part of the problem that's going on here. And a lot of states, especially places that are underfunded and don't have a good tax base, they end up using the police as a way to raise money. And that ends up being persecuting their actual members of their own community or people in the nearby areas. That's the ones who are being pulled over. And so that's just a bigger thing about why are police being used as that. Sorry, I'll quiet down. I really like the presentation. I thought you asked good questions.
I just wanted to say we were having this has been a couple of years, but we were having a use of force discussion, and one of the most profound things that I heard a student say, and it really changed the way, and you, Philip, Theodore, Peter, were kind of talking about some of this, it really changed the way that I looked at all of this. We were talking about fixing the system, right? This was before the defund the police was being used, but how are we fixing the system? And the student just matter-of-factly said, how do you fix something that's working exactly how it was designed to work. And that's going back to what Jeffrey said about the history of it. And I really didn't understand what he meant until hours later when I was laying in bed and I was like, oh my gosh, he's right. You know, we went from slavery to sharecropping all the way up through the redlining and mass incarceration. We just changed the way the system, you know, how we do it, but the system is still working exactly how it was set to work. And so how do we fix something that's not broken? And I don't have the answer either, but that student really changed the way I think about all of this. So,
and I think that's the problem. Most people are not aware, to chime in right quick, the history of American policing, when slavery was abolished, everyone outnumbered whites maybe 5 to 1, and there was a need to control the masses, and policing was aggressive just as they were during slavery, and that has continued. Now we have to break away from that approach because we're seeing the end result, and that's correct. Most people are not aware of it.
And not just control the masses, but continue to provide free labor, which is what the privately owned prison system still continue to do today.
Exactly.
And I think one of the ways in which we can approach this is not looking at fixing the system, but looking at our responses to the system's actions. In a panel with Cornel West, he stated that we need to learn how to become wounded healers and love warriors and freedom fighters. And I think that if we can change our response to it, sometimes it'll make it better until things can change for themselves. Well, until we can work it out. But I think our initial response, we have to change the ways in which we respond, because sometimes these things happen to get a response, an expected response.
I'm thinking a little bit about what Jeff said earlier about why do we need police for these low-level traffic stops, for instance, you know, and certainly all of those kinds of things tie into these larger conversations about how we should fund police, or, you know, I'm even sort of making a connection to Autumn's work and thinking about voting and how do we elect the right people to move these agendas forward. So I do think that all of these things are connected and the ways in which people have had to fight to get access to them. But to go back to the earlier piece, which was Jeff saying this one question about why do we need police to do that? And I'm imagining and I'm remembering that, like, when you drive through the tollways here in Pennsylvania, if you don't pay your money going through, it snaps a picture, you get a ticket in the mail, right? And so there are real things that we could do that would simply eliminate the need for that kind of interaction. You got a dash cam video at this point. If you see a broken tail light, take a damn picture and send it. You know, send the ticket later or send the warning later. And if it shows up in your system again, now you're going to get a ticket. That interaction doesn't have to happen. It's unfortunate that you have to look for ways to limit the interaction of police with citizens in order to try to limit the violence that's happening in your society. But I really do think that that's kind of where we are. We have to look for the strategies that get policing out of these functions that they never were intended to be in, and that we're seeing more and more harms happening as a result of them being there than we are seeing the community being strengthened and built up and relationships improving, right? And so if it's not working, there is no rationale for continuing in that direction. Let's do something different. So as we're thinking about what our possible futures are, I think those are the kinds of things that we have to really get very clear about. There are things that we can do, and it's not hopeless. We can make different decisions as a society. We're going to have to fight tooth and nail to get there, but it can happen.
I really enjoyed your presentation, Peter. It was great. I did have one question just because I'm not an expert on law, so I wanted some clarification. With the charges brought against an officer, is his conviction reliant upon his status as a law enforcement agent? So if he's not convicted, can he still be fired and be removed from the position of law enforcement? Or is that, with how the union operates, completely reliant on having to be convicted?
So I don't know all the details on that, but he was removed, and it basically just goes on to, like, you know, the public pressure from the outcry. You know, they're not going to they're going to be extremely angry if he's still out there policing. That's going to be counteractive to the mission of the police department. So they had to remove him. But
I was just curious because
yeah.
you had discussed the controversy over how high or low of a charge should a prosecution go for, and if his employment status was relying upon conviction, that would obviously be a factor. So I was just curious about that. Thank you.
I can piggyback right quick. What they're saying is that police officers have a unique charge, and they are allowed to take someone's life, but there's certain standards. And some of it is fear, the other is the danger to protect other people. And officers have been doing it for a while. I'm a former police officer myself for 13 years. And now that, again, that process that we're thinking and responding is changing. And they're saying that you're not only killing, but it's beginning to be too frequent. And I think that is where the attention is coming in and where there needs to be change, and especially because most of those that they've shot are unarmed. So there's a lot that needs to be investigated. I'm muting now.
Autumn, if I could, I'm going to pull you back in a more direct way, since you were researching some of the attitudes and strategies that suffragists used. I'm wondering if there are any lessons to be learned there that we could be thinking about as we consider how to make other changes in our society. Or did you learn anything that could be useful to us here?
So something that was interesting, as I talked about, within the suffrage movement, you have this divide on the topic of race. And even once the suffrage amendment, the 19th Amendment is ratified, as feminist groups evolve from that, you still have this component of race and how inclusive are they? And that is still an issue in today's society, is how inclusive are feminist groups in raising voices of African-American women, but also lots of different races and ethnicities and religious groups, and not just being a predominantly white group. So that's something that's still going on today, and you can see from the origins of the suffrage movement to the different feminist groups that come about and the current feminist movement now and inclusivity of race. Something that was interesting that I came upon with my research is we do have this national narrative of only those who opposed suffrage were male, but there was a large presence of women who actually opposed the ability for a woman to have the right to vote. It seems a little odd, but because of how the social norms functioned and the society they were raised in, they felt that it was absolutely wrong for a woman to vote and that a real woman wouldn't want that. And I think you can apply that to many different aspects of being aware that there are instances where there are those who aren't educated or do not realize in what ways they are being oppressed, and sometimes they're not fighting for their fellow person, whether that is women not fighting for fellow women in areas of liberation. We see that divide still today, especially in politics, when women support policies or programs that are at a disadvantage for women, and that can also transition into race. There's been a lot of discussion about when you look at the police force, when minority officers are, I'm trying to think of the word, but when we look at George Floyd, the officer who was of Asian descent, he stood by and watched and did not intervene. And so that has been transitioned into those conversations, as well as also inclusion among minority groups together, and this idea of fighting for one another and being aware of the oppression that each one faces.
Thank you. Dr. Ferragamo, I think we better wrap it up.
I think so, and it's been a very robust conversation, and I would like to thank and congratulate all of our presenters on an excellent job and giving us some things to think about. And hopefully we can move forward and continue this conversation. If you will look at the bottom of the chat screen, I have included the evaluation website. And here is also the hyperlink. It comes up. Of course, it's not. Try this way.
Are you talking about the
attendance?
Yeah, I think I have it up.
Okay.
I think I do.